The night sky above Thornvale Pack territory was full of stars, but no one was looking up. They were all looking at Kael Voss. He stood at the center of the stone circle that the pack had used for ceremonies for over 300 years. Torches burned in iron posts around the outer edge of the circle, their light catching the sharp lines of his face and the dark fabric of his formal jacket. His silver eyes moved across the crowd in slow, deliberate sweeps, the way a man looks when he wants every person present to know they are being watched. He did not smile, he did not fidget. He simply stood at the center of everything, exactly where he had always stood, exactly where everyone expected him to be. The pack gathered in wide rings around the stone circle. Hundreds of wolves, some pressed close together in the cold evening air. Others stood with their backs straight and their chins up, the posture of people who wanted their alpha to see them showing respect. Children stood at the outer edges with their parents, too young to understand the full meaning of tonight, but old enough to feel the weight of it. Every face was turned toward the center. Tonight, Kael Voss, Alpha King, was taking a Luna. Alara Stone stood just inside the circle, 3 steps from Kael, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes when the torchlight caught them. She wore a white dress with long sleeves and a simple neckline. Her dark hair was pinned back with no decoration. She had not done anything dramatic with her appearance. She was not trying to impress the crowd, and she was not performing the role of a nervous bride. She was simply there, present and still, facing the largest gathering of wolves she had ever stood before without flinching. She was 24 years old. She had grown up in the Hollow Creek Pack, 3 territories away, the daughter of a border security officer and a woman who had taught her that the most dangerous thing a person could do was pretend to be smaller than they were, in order to make others comfortable. She had met Kael Voss 3 times before tonight. The first meeting had been brief and entirely formal, the kind of meeting held across a long table with senior wolves from both packs, seated at either side, and a document of intentions, positioned in the center like a referee. The second had been a dinner that lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Kael said very little, but watched her constantly, the way a man watches something he is trying to understand. The third had been a walk on the grounds of a neutral property, lasting 18 minutes, during which Kael had asked her 2 direct questions about her background, and nodded at both of her answers, as though he was checking information against a list he had already prepared. She had not been frightened by any of those meetings. She had been paying attention, and what she paid attention to had told her several clear things about Kael Voss. He was controlled. He was precise. He used silence as a tool, letting it sit between people until they felt pressured to fill it, and then watching what they said when they felt that pressure. He had built something around himself, some kind of careful arrangement of posture and expression and deliberate distance, and she suspected he had maintained it for so long that he had forgotten it was a thing he was doing, rather than simply a thing he was. She had told herself, on the drive to Thornvale that morning, that she would be a good Luna. She would be loyal to the pack and fair to every wolf in it. She would work hard, and she would show up, and she would not disappear into the background when things became difficult. Those were the promises she had made to herself, the ones that mattered, the ones she intended to keep. Owen, Kael's beta, stood near the northern edge of the stone circle. He was a large man, mid-30s, with a short, well-kept beard and the kind of steady eyes that take in everything, without giving much back. He had introduced himself to Alara that afternoon, with a handshake that was firm but not aggressive, and a look that was measuring but not unkind. She had decided she could work with Owen. She had also decided he was entirely devoted to Kael, and would be watching tonight to see what the new Luna was made of. Elder Felix stood at the front of the gathered crowd. He had white hair and hands that showed decades of work, and his voice still carried without effort when he spoke. "We gather tonight under the open sky," Felix said, and his voice spread out across the crowd and reached the very back of it without strain. "As all the packs before us have gathered, to witness the bond between Alpha and Luna, to see it spoken in this place, to hold it as true." The silence that followed was total. No one coughed. No child made a sound. Even the wind seemed to slow. Kael stepped forward and faced Alara. She turned to face him. They looked at each other, across the short distance between them, and whatever was in that look was not warmth, and it was not hostility, and it was not pretense. It was 2 people who were about to make a permanent decision, and were both, in their different ways, carrying that fact clearly. Felix spoke the formal words of the bonding ceremony. Cale repeated his portion in a clear, measured voice that carried perfectly across the circle. Elara repeated hers without looking away from Cale's face, her voice steady and unhurried. When the words were done, Felix gave one small nod and stepped back. That was the moment everything should have ended. The crowd should have breathed out. Someone at the back should have started to clap. The ceremony was complete. The night was supposed to move forward into celebration and warm rooms and food on long tables. But Cale did not step back. He stood perfectly still in the torchlight, and he looked at Elara, and then he said, in a voice that was not loud and did not need to be, because the silence made every word carry, "From this night forward, you will address me as Alpha King." Elara did not move a single muscle. The words landed in the air between them and hung there. Not a request, not a suggestion offered gently between people who were beginning something together. A command, said clearly in front of witnesses, during the ceremony itself, so that there could be no ambiguity about it later. Elara heard it. She heard every syllable and every implication inside the syllables. She heard the assumption built into it, the expectation that the word would land, and she would nod, and the matter would be settled. She heard the public nature of it, the way it had been delivered to the crowd, as much as to her. She heard all of it, and she said nothing. Her hands were at her sides. Her face did not change. She held Cale's gaze the way you hold something steady when you need to carry it carefully, without spilling, completely still, giving nothing away. Someone in the crowd shifted. Two wolves near the outer ring exchanged a fast look. Owen, at the edge of the circle, did not change his expression, but the muscles across his shoulders tightened by a fraction. Cale waited. He was a man who was accustomed to waiting being a power, accustomed to the silence he created being the thing that made other people move first. He waited with the patience of someone who had used this particular tool many times and knew exactly how effective it was. Elara let him wait. She counted, in her own head, to a number that felt right, and then she turned her head and looked at Elder Felix. Felix, who had presided over more ceremonies than he could remember, and had the particular composure of very old men who have seen situations like this before, gave a small, practiced nod and stepped forward to close the ceremony. He spoke the final words with the same even tone he had used throughout, and the moment was folded into the rest of the evening, and the crowd began to exhale and murmur and shift, and the night moved forward as though the pause had not happened. But it had happened. Every person in that circle knew it. The gathering moved into the main hall. Food was set out on long wooden tables. There were candles, and the smell of warm bread, and people talking in the low, comfortable tones of a community that was at ease with itself. Children ran between the legs of adults. The older pack members found their usual spots and settled into them. Owen moved through the room, doing the quiet work of making sure everything was running correctly. Elara sat between Nadia, a woman with quick eyes who had met her at the border that morning, and introduced herself with a directness that Elara appreciated, and Grant, an older wolf who said almost nothing but refilled her water glass twice without being asked, which she appreciated even more. Cale sat at the head of the main table. He ate his meal. He spoke to Owen and to Felix and to several senior wolves who came to him with questions and small matters of business, and his face throughout the evening was composed and unreadable, the face of a man managing his environment with complete control. He did not look at Elara more than twice during the entire meal. Both times, she was already looking at him. Near the end of the evening, when people were beginning to say their good nights and collect their children from various corners, Nadia leaned close to Elara and said quietly, "You should know that nobody has ever done that before." "Done what?" Elara asked. "What you did in the circle," Nadia said. "The way you just stood there, made him wait." She paused. "Nobody does that to Cale Voss." Elara picked up her glass and drank, and did not respond, and Nadia watched her for a moment, and then nodded to herself, some private conclusion reached, and let the matter rest. On the path back to the main house, through the gap in the old oak trees where the stone path curved, Cale fell into step beside Elara. He did not reach out to stop her. He simply matched her pace and walked beside her, and after a moment, she slowed to a stop, because she understood he needed her to stop. "You did not answer me," he said. "No," she said. "I did not. That was not a choice I gave you. I am aware, she said. He looked at her. The torchlight from the hall was behind them now, and the moon was the main source of light, and in it, his face was all silver and shadow. I will ask you again, he said, and I expect a different response. Then you will be disappointed again, she said, without heat, without any performance of defiance, simply as a fact. Something moved in his expression. It was not quite anger. It was the look of a man recalculating. I am the Alpha King, he said. This pack runs on order. Order begins with how people address one another. That is not arbitrary. I understand order, Alara said. I grew up in a pack. I know what it means for an alpha to lead and for a pack to follow. What I am telling you is that how I address you personally is not part of the chain of command. It belongs to me. You are my Luna, he said. Yes, she said. I am. Which means I am your equal in this partnership, not a wolf in your hierarchy. There is a difference, and I think you know there is a difference, which is why the command made you feel powerful when you gave it. The silence that followed was long and quiet, and full of something neither of them named. What are you saying to me? He asked at last. I am saying, she said carefully, that I will not call you Alpha King, because you ordered me to. I am also saying that if you want me to address you by any name at all, you are going to have to give me a reason to want to, and a command is not a reason. She walked the rest of the path to the house, and went inside, and he stood in the dark under the oak trees with his hands still at his sides, and the night moved around him, and did not ask him how he was feeling about any of it. In her room on the second floor, with the window open and the curtain moving in the breeze, Alara sat on the edge of the bed and thought. She thought about the command in the circle. She thought about the path conversation. She thought about the years stretching ahead of her in this house, with this man in this pack. Then she made her decision. For 1 year she would not speak his name. Not his title, and not his given name. Neither one. Not because she was angry. Not because she wanted to punish him. But because some things cannot be commanded, and she needed him to understand that. She needed herself to understand it too. To prove to the part of her that was still measuring the weight of this situation, that she knew who she was, and did not become less of that person, because someone powerful had told her to. She lay down and closed her eyes, and was asleep before she had even finished the thought. Down the hallway in the study at the far end, Cale sat at his desk with a report open in front of him. He had read 4 pages, and retained none of them. He set the pen down and looked at the dark window. He was certain she would change her mind within a few days. He was very certain of it. He was a patient man when patience was required, and he was willing to give her time to adjust to the reality of what her life in Thornvale would be. He picked up the report and began reading the first page again. E. The kitchen in the main house was warm the following morning, full of the smell of bread and ground coffee. Nadia sat at the end of the long wooden table with a mug and a stack of papers she was working through. 2 younger pack members moved between the stove and the counters, quiet and efficient in the way of people who had been doing the same morning task for years. Alara came in at 7:30. She wore a plain gray shirt and dark trousers. She moved through the kitchen like someone who had been in 100 different kitchens, and was comfortable in all of them, found the coffee without asking where it was kept, poured herself a mug, and sat across from Nadia. She said good morning in a voice that was warm, without being over-friendly. Nadia looked at her over the edge of her papers. You slept. I did, Alara said. 12 minutes later, Cale came in from the outside door. He had been somewhere already that morning, something physical by the look of him, slightly windblown, eyes very clear. He wore plain clothes, nothing formal, and he moved through the kitchen with the same quality of ownership he brought to every space he entered. Not arrogance exactly, more the settled certainty of a person who has never had to wonder whether he belongs somewhere. He looked at Alara. She looked at him. Then she looked at her coffee. Good morning, she said. He was listening for his title. She could feel him listening for it, in the pause after she spoke. Good morning, and then nothing. Not Alpha King. Not the name she had told him she would not say. Nothing at all, except the ordinary greeting that anyone might offer any person they encountered at the start of a day. He sat at the head of the table. One of the younger pack members brought him coffee, and Cale thanked the young man by name, which was a small thing, but one that Alara noted and filed away quietly. I have reports to go through this morning, Cale said. He was looking at the table, but the words were angled at Alara. I want you in the East study at 10. All right, she said. Not yes, Alpha King, not a dip of the head or any gesture of deference. Just, all right, clean and flat, the way you agree to a meeting time. Nadia pressed her lips together slightly over the top of her mug. At 10, Ilara walked into the east study and found Owen already there by the window and Cale at the central table, bent over a map with a marking pen. The room smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular dry cold of a space that does not get much direct sunlight. There were shelves along every wall, full of bound reports organized by year and territory. The meeting covered the morning's primary concerns: patrol schedules, a report about activity near the boundary line with Ashwood territory, updates from 2 outer settlements. Cale spoke in clear, precise terms. Owen contributed in the same way. Ilara sat and listened for the first 15 minutes, getting the shape of the information in her head, understanding the gaps in what she was being told versus what she needed to know. Then she asked 3 questions. The first was about the timing interval between the Northeastern Patrol and the one that covered the ridgeline beyond it. The second was about whether the outer settlements had independent communication channels or whether all reports were funneled through the main house. The third was about who had conducted the Ashwood boundary assessment and when. There was a short silence after the third question. Owen set down his mug and said, "The northeastern interval runs 35 minutes unguarded between 2 and 3 in the morning." "I know," Ilara said. "That is why I asked about it." Owen looked at Cale. Cale was looking at Ilara. "You have a border security background," he said. It was almost a question. "My father ran border security in Hollow Creek for 19 years. I spent most of my childhood in those reports." She paused. 35 minutes is too long. In Hollow Creek, we lost 3 wolves in a single season, to a gap that was 20 minutes. Cale looked at the map for a moment. Then he said, "Fix it," to Owen, and Owen wrote something down without comment. Then Cale looked back at Ilara with an expression she could not entirely read, and said nothing more on the subject. It was not a thank you, but it was not nothing either. The meeting ended an hour later. As people gathered their papers, Owen paused near the door and gave Ilara a look that was brief and entirely neutral, but somehow communicated that he had noticed several things this morning and would be thinking about them later. That afternoon, Cale found her. She was in the small walled garden at the back of the house, sitting on a low stone wall with her legs stretched out in front of her and her face turned toward the weak afternoon sun. She heard him on the path before she saw him, and did not change her position. He stopped a few feet away. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. "I want to talk to you," he said. "All right," she said. He came closer but did not sit. Standing gave him height advantage, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. And none of that information passed between them as words. "You did not follow my instruction this morning," he said. "No," she agreed. "You said good morning to me, and stopped there." "Yes. I need you to tell me why." Ilara looked at him directly. "Because you told me to call you by your title," she said. "That is the complete reason. The moment you made it a command, you made it something I could not do." A line formed between his brows. "That does not make logical sense." "It does, actually," she said. "The way I address a person is mine to decide. It belongs to me, the same way a thought belongs to me before I say it out loud. You can command how I dress for formal occasions. You can command where I stand in a ceremony, and what responsibilities I take on in this pack. You cannot command the words I choose to use when I speak to you directly. That is too personal to be put in an order." Cale was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was cool, and the garden was very still around them. "You are the Luna of this pack," he said. "There are expectations that come with that role." "There are," she agreed. "I intend to meet all of them. I will be a good Luna. I will be fair and available, and I will do the work that needs to be done. What I will not do is give you something personal on command." "What I asked for was not personal," he said. "It was a title, a formal address between a Luna and her alpha. Then it should have been easy to ask for without making it an order," she said. "The fact that you made it a public command on the night we were bonded tells me something about why you want it." Something shifted in his face. It was small, a tightening somewhere around his eyes, a thing that came and went very quickly. "What do you think it tells you?" he said. "That you needed the crowd there when you said it," she said. "That you wanted witnesses, which means the title was not just about me, it was about something else." He said nothing. The quiet stretched between them, long and tight. So what exactly are you proposing? He said finally, and his voice had the careful flatness of a person keeping something out of it deliberately. I am not proposing anything, Ilara said. I am telling you what I have decided. For 1 year, I will not call you anything, not your title and not your name. When I need to speak to you directly, I will use the word you, or I will manage without any label at all. She held his gaze. At the end of the year, we will see where we are. The silence after this was different from the silence before it, longer, heavier, full of something that was taking shape. That is a child's response, he said. It was a command that you gave me, she said, on a night that should have been something better than that. She stood from the wall and picked up the book she had set beside her and walked back toward the house with the same unhurried pace she always carried, and Cale stood in the garden for a long time after she was gone. News in a pack moves the way water moves through stone. Not fast, not loud, but persistent and thorough. By the evening of that second day, the general awareness had spread through Thornvale that the new Luna had not used the Alpha King's title since the ceremony, that he had spoken to her about it twice, and that on both occasions she had walked away still not having said it. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody stood up at the dinner table and announced it. It simply became a thing that people knew, the way a pack knows things, through proximity and instinct and the particular sensitivity that comes from living closely together. Grant, who had been in Thornvale for over 4 decades, sat in his chair by the fire that evening and said nothing to the 2 young wolves nearby. But he was not paying attention to them at all. He was thinking about something he had not thought about in a long time, something from the early years of the Voss family's rule that he had stored away in the part of his memory reserved for things that were true and uncomfortable. He took a sip of his drink and kept his thoughts to himself. Owen found Cale in the south corridor after the evening meal. The corridor was a long, stone-floored passage that connected the main hall to the wing, where the private offices were kept, and it was almost always empty at night. Owen fell into step beside Cale without ceremony. They walked together for a moment before Owen said quietly, "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," Cale said. "All right," Owen said. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence. At the door to Cale's study, Owen stopped. "She found the patrol interval herself," he said, without anyone pointing her toward it. Cale stopped with his hand on the door. He said nothing. "Took me 6 months to notice it when I first read those reports," Owen said. "Just mentioning it." Cale went into his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk for a while. The lamp was on. The room was quiet. There were papers he needed to go through, and correspondence he needed to respond to, and a territorial map he had been planning to revise. He did none of it. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the middle distance. He was not accustomed to situations he had not anticipated. His entire leadership had been built on anticipation, on seeing problems before they arrived and having a response ready when they did. He planned. He prepared. He did not like surprises, and he had made sure, over many years of careful management, that his life contained very few of them. Ilara Stone was a surprise, not in the way he might have expected to be surprised by a new Luna. Not in any way he had planned a response for. She had not argued with him, not loudly. She had not made threats or demands. She had simply told him, twice now, in the same unhurried voice, that she had decided something, and that his instructions were not relevant to her decision. He had been Alpha King for 11 years. He could not think of the last time someone had told him his instructions were not relevant. He pulled the territorial map toward him and forced himself to focus on it. The eastern boundary needed attention. That was real and present and within his control, and he intended to keep his attention on things that were within his control. Nadia knocked on Ilara's door at 9:30. She came in and stood near the bookshelf and looked at Ilara, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed with a book open and seemed perfectly settled. "He is going to push on this," Nadia said. "I imagine so," Ilara said. "Cale Voss does not give up on things he has decided." "Then we have that in common," Ilara said. Nadia leaned against the bookshelf with her arms folded. She had a way of studying people that was very direct, without being aggressive, the look of someone who genuinely wanted to understand a situation, and was not embarrassed about that wanting. "Why a year?" she asked. Ilara thought about it. "Because a year is long enough to be serious," she said. "Short enough to be survivable." She turned a page. "And because at the end of it, I will have to decide Both of us will know something true. What will you know? Whether he can change his mind about how he uses power. She looked up. And whether I am the kind of person who holds something like this, or whether I only thought I was. Nadia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And what about him? What does he learn?" Alara smiled slightly. "That is his business," she said. "What he does with a year is up to him." Nadia left after a few more minutes, and Alara read for another hour before turning out the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house settling, the night sounds of the territory outside the window, the far-off movement of the wind through the old trees at the border. She was not anxious, she was not uncertain. She was the Luna of Thornvale Pack, and she had already begun. By the end of the first month, 3 things had become clear to everyone in Thornvale. The first was that the new Luna was excellent at her work. She had taken over the management of the Pack's community schedules, the medical records of the outer settlements, and the coordination of supplies between the main house and the 9 residential clusters spread across the territory. She did all of it without being asked and without making a production of it, and she did it well. The Pack members who dealt with her directly came away from those interactions with the impression that she was someone who paid close attention and did not waste their time. The second thing that became clear was that she had a way of speaking in meetings that made other people say more than they had intended to. She did not press. She did not push. She asked questions in a certain sequence and then went quiet. And into that quiet, people poured information they had been holding, without knowing they were holding it. The third thing was that she had not once spoken the Alpha King's name, or his title, in 31 days, and she was not going to. The way she managed it was, over time, something that the Pack members who paid attention began to privately admire, even while they had no idea what to make of it. In council meetings, she addressed points Cale made, by responding to what he had said, rather than to him, pivoting the conversation in a way that kept everything moving forward, without requiring her to direct anything at him by name. When she needed to relay something to him through another person, she phrased it with perfect accuracy in the third person. When he spoke to her directly, and waited for a response that included his title, she gave him a complete and useful answer that contained everything he needed except those words. She was never rude. She was never cold. She was often the warmest person in the room. She just did not say his name. The council met on the 8th day of the 2nd month. Cale had called the session to discuss a proposed adjustment to the Pack's winter supply allocation, a subject with enough complexity that it required everyone present to pay full attention. Senior wolves sat around the long table in the main meeting room. Felix was there. Owen was there. Grant was there, old and alert in his chair near the window. 2 younger council members named Dean and Iris sat across from each other, with their papers organized and their expressions serious. Alara sat to the left of the head of the table. Cale sat at the head. The supply discussion moved through its first half hour without incident. Numbers were compared. Alternative approaches weighed. Then a disagreement opened up between Dean and Grant about the allocation priorities for the 2 southeastern settlements, and the room split into a low-level debate that was going in circles. Cale waited for a natural pause, and then looked at Alara. "What is your view?" She did not hesitate. "The southeastern settlements have different needs in winter than the northern clusters," she said. "The population in the south skews older, and the terrain makes resupply harder after the first heavy frost. The allocation should wait for both of those factors, not just the population numbers." She paused. "What would help is if the person leading the assessment has actually visited both sites before the first frost." "That is your suggestion?" Cale said. "It is," she said. "Then go," he said. "Take Owen, report back within the week." She nodded. Simple as that. A decision made, a direction given, a nod received. No title exchanged. Later, as the council dispersed into the corridor, Dean appeared beside Alara with the look of someone who had been building up to a question for a while. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try," she said pleasantly. He glanced down the corridor to make sure no one else was in earshot. "Does he know you are doing it on purpose?" he asked. "The way you talk around him without actually saying anything to him by name?" Alara looked at Dean steadily. He was young for the council, probably 28, with an open face that gave away most of what he was thinking. "He knows," she said. Dean blinked. "And he is all right with it?" He is not all right with it at all, Alara said. That is rather the point. Dean stood there for a moment, looking like a person trying to do complicated arithmetic in his head. Then he nodded slowly and walked away. Cale tried several approaches in the weeks that followed. The first was simple patience. He waited for her to slip, to use his name by accident, to have a moment of inattention. She did not slip. She was not managing this through effort. It had become natural to her with remarkable speed, the way a person naturally stops walking through a room where furniture has been moved and begins navigating the new layout. The second approach was the formal occasion. There was a small gathering on the 15th day of the second month, a welcome dinner for a family moving into one of the northern clusters. Cale attended. Alara attended. At one point, with the table full of people and wine poured, and the general warmth of a party, Cale leaned close to Alara and said quietly, "Say my name." She turned and looked at him, with an expression that was almost gentle. "No," she said, in the same tone she might use to decline a second helping, and turned back to the conversation she had been having with the family's eldest daughter. The third approach, which he tried in the 7th week, was to pretend it did not matter. He became very casual about the whole thing, very relaxed, as though the entire situation had stopped being relevant to him. He stopped waiting for her to say his name or his title. He greeted her in the mornings without any particular expectation in his voice. He addressed her in meetings, as though everything between them was operating on completely normal terms. It almost worked. Not in the way he hoped, not in the way that made her relent, but in the way that meant they began to spend time in the same room, without the specific tension that had lived between them for the first weeks. They were both busy people with a large amount of work to do, and shared work has a way of building its own kind of understanding, regardless of what else is happening. They went to the southeastern settlements together at the end of the second month. Owen drove. Cale sat in the front. Alara sat in the back with a notebook and a list of questions she had prepared the previous evening. The drive took 2.5 hours on roads that were good in some stretches and very poor in others. The first settlement was called Deepwater. It sat at the bottom of a shallow valley between two ridges, and the people there were, as Alara had suspected from the records, an older community with particular needs that the general supply allocation had been underserving. The settlement leader was a woman named Clara, who had been running Deepwater for 12 years, and had a way of watching Cale that was careful and specific, the look of someone who has been waiting to make a point for a long time. She walked through the storage areas and the medical supply room, and the small school at the center of the settlement. She asked questions, and took notes, and listened to the answers fully, not partially, without mentally composing her next question, while the person across from her was still speaking. By the time they left Deepwater, Clara had provided more detailed information about the settlement's winter vulnerabilities than had appeared in any report in the previous 3 years. On the drive to the second settlement, Cale turned around from the front seat and looked at Alara. "How did you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "She has not talked to a Central Council representative that much in years," he said. "She usually gives single-sentence answers and ends the meeting early." Alara looked up from her notes. "I asked her about things that mattered to her," she said. "People talk when they believe the person listening is actually listening." There was a short pause. Owen watched the road. Cale watched Alara. "That is not nothing," Cale said. He said it the way a person says a thing they did not fully intend to say out loud, and then he turned back to face the front. Alara looked at her notes. The third month ended with a small celebration in the main hall, a birthday for one of the older pack members, a wolf named Ruth who had turned 70, and was celebrated with the kind of warmth that a community reserves for people who have been part of its fabric for long enough to be inseparable from it. Alara organized the decorations and the food, and made sure Ruth's favorite songs were played by the 2 pack members who kept instruments. At one point during the evening, Ruth found Alara near the food table and took her hands and held them, the way very old people sometimes hold the hands of people they are trying to tell something to without words. "You are good for this pack," Ruth said. "I can feel it." Alara squeezed her hands. "That is all I am trying to be," she said. Ruth looked at her with eyes that were old and very clear. "He is not easy," she said quietly. "But there is something in him worth the trouble." She let go of Alara's hands. "I have known him since he was 8 years old. I know what I am saying." Alara said nothing to that. She just smiled, and Ruth nodded, as though the smile was the answer she had expected, and moved away. Later that evening, Cale stood at the far end of the hall, near the window that looked out over the grounds. He was watching the room rather than participating in it, which was a thing Alara had noticed he did at social gatherings, positioning himself somewhere with a sight line to everything, never quite inside the warmth of the group, always slightly apart. She thought about what Ruth had said. There is something in him worth the trouble. She did not go over to him. She did not need to. But she watched him for a moment, this man who commanded hundreds of wolves and managed an enormous territory, and could not, apparently, ask his mate to address him by name without turning it into an order, and she thought about what it would cost a person to be that controlled, to live inside that much deliberate distance from everything around them. She thought about it, and then she thought about something else, and the evening went on around her, warm and loud and full of the ordinary life of a pack that was healthy and busy and, in its way, content. She was starting, despite herself, to feel like part of it. Cale watched her from the far end of the hall and thought about 3 months of meetings and drives and dinners and arguments he had not won. He thought about Deepwater and Clara talking for an hour and the notes in the back seat of the car. He thought about the fact that in 3 months she had not once slipped. He was the Alpha King. He had outlasted harder things than a woman who would not say his name. He picked up his glass and drank and kept his thoughts to himself. 3 days after the birthday celebration, Cale tried something new. He found her in the morning, before the household was fully awake, in the reading room, where she sometimes went with her coffee when she wanted to think. He came in and sat down across from her, not beside her, not at the head of anything. Just across the table, at the same level, with his own coffee. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "Not tell. Ask." She set her cup down. "All right. Would you consider using my name?" he said. "Not the title, my name." The room was very still around them. The morning light was just starting to come through the window, pale and thin. "No," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "Why not?" "Because the year is not done," she said. "And because I said I would not, and I will not, go back on what I said. Even if I am asking instead of commanding." She looked at him for a moment, with something that was not cruelty, and not softness, but something between the two, the look of a person who is being honest about a hard thing. "The year started because of a command," she said. "The year will end as I said it would. At the end of it, we will both know things we do not know yet." He looked at the table. A muscle moved in his jaw. Then he looked back up. "What do you think I will learn?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "That is the point." He stood and picked up his coffee and walked to the door. He stopped there. He did not turn around. "You are the most difficult person I have ever met," he said, and the way he said it was not entirely unkind. "I know," she said. He left. She sat in the reading room for another hour, the light growing stronger around her, and she thought about the look on his face when he had asked, instead of commanded. It was not a look she had expected to see on him. It was not a look she had a name for yet. She turned it over carefully in her mind, and then set it aside, because the year was not done. It happened on an ordinary evening in the 4th month. Cale was in his study at 10:30 at night, working through a set of financial reports on the Eastern Territory allocations, when it occurred to him that he had not heard someone say his name in 43 days. He counted back. He was not careless with numbers, and he was not wrong. 43 days. Not Alpha King. He heard that 30 times a day, from Owen and from council members, and from wolves who came to the main house with requests or information. Alpha King from every direction. But Cale, the 2 syllables his mother had spoken to him every morning of his childhood, reaching for him across the kitchen with a coffee mug and a piece of bread, just those 2 syllables from a voice that was warm and had no strategy behind it. He had not heard that in 43 days. He set the report down and looked at the lamp. He had not realized he was counting. He had also not realized, until this moment, sitting at his desk at 10:30, with the territory quiet outside the window, that there was a difference he had stopped paying attention to. The title was something he carried, something he had always carried, since the day his father had stood him in front of the pack at 11 years old and told him to remember what he was. The title was real, and it mattered, and it was his. But somewhere behind the title, there was still a person, and that person had a name, and the name was Cale, and Alara Stone had been in his house for 4 months, and had refused to say either one. He had spent 4 months trying to get her to say the title. It was the name he had actually been waiting for. He stood up from the desk and walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds. The moon was up. The patrol lights were on at the borderline, small and steady in the distance. Everything out there was in order. Everything out there was exactly as it should be. He thought about his mother. Her name had been Helena. She had died when he was 15, a winter illness that came fast and went faster. He had not cried at the funeral because his father had told him, the morning of the service, that alphas do not show grief in front of their pack. He had stood at the front of the gathering with his face arranged into the correct expression and had said the correct things, and had been told, afterward, by several senior wolves, that he had conducted himself well. He had conducted himself well. He thought about the last time he had heard his name from her. She had been sick for 3 days by then, and he had come into her room in the afternoon, and she had turned her head on the pillow and said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely herself, "Kale, come sit with me." And he had sat with her, and she had talked about small things, the garden, and a book she had been reading, and something funny one of the pack children had done that she had heard about. She had not talked about being sick. She had not talked about him being the next alpha. She had just talked to him, like a person who wanted company, and was glad he was there. He had been 15 years old. He stood at the window and looked at the patrol lights and did not let himself follow that line of thought any further, because there was nothing useful at the end of it, and he was a man who did not spend time on things that were not useful. But the counting had started. He knew, from that evening forward, exactly how many days it had been since someone had spoken his actual name to him. At breakfast the next morning he sat across from Alara and watched her talk to Nadia about the supply run she had organized for the following week, and he thought about the fact that she was sitting 3 feet away from him and had been for 4 months, and had not once said the 2 syllables that were his. He watched her hands move when she talked. She used her hands slightly, not dramatically, but in a way that helped her make a point. She looked at Nadia when Nadia spoke, really looked at her, the way a person does when they are genuinely listening, rather than waiting for their turn. She laughed at something Nadia said, a real laugh, short and clean, and then went back to her point. He had not seen her perform anything since she arrived, not her competence, not her warmth, not her humor. Every part of her appeared to be the same whether anyone was watching or not. He had spent enough time watching people manage their impressions in front of him that the absence of it in someone was almost surprising. He tried, that week, something different from anything he had tried before. He did not try to get her to say his name. He did not engineer situations or wait for opportunities. He simply, over the course of 4 days, made an effort to be different in the ordinary small moments they shared. He asked her one evening about Hollow Creek, not about the pack structure or the border history, but about what it had been like to grow up there, what she remembered about it. He listened to her answer and did not redirect it toward anything useful or relevant to Thornvale. She talked about the river that ran through the center of the Hollow Creek territory, and how it was dry in summer and full in spring, and how the children used it differently depending on the season. She talked about a wolf named Bernard who had run a small workshop and had let her spend entire Saturday mornings there, learning how to fix mechanical things, which had annoyed her father, because he had been saving those Saturday mornings for border training. She told the story plainly, without performing nostalgia or trying to create a particular impression. He asked her one question during the story, and she answered it, and kept going, and he sat and listened, and did not think about any reports at all. After she finished, there was a short quiet between them, the kind that follows a thing well said. Then she looked at him and said, "What about you? Where did you grow up inside this house? Where did you actually live, I mean, not where did you hold meetings and make decisions?" He was surprised enough by the question that he answered it honestly. He told her about the back staircase that connected the kitchen to the upper floor, and how he had spent an enormous portion of his childhood on it, specifically on the 7th step from the bottom, which had a good view of the kitchen door and a bad view of the main corridor, so that you could see people coming in from outside, but they could not see you. He had done most of his serious reading on that step between the ages of 10 and 13. Alara looked at him with something that he could not quite name, and that he thought about later when he was alone. "That is a child who wanted to see the world without being seen in it," she said. He said nothing. "I understand that," she said, not as a challenge, just as a statement of fact. And then she picked up her cup and took a sip, and they sat there in a quiet that was different from all the other quiets they had shared, because this one did not have a contest in it. On the 49th day, Owen found Cale in the south corridor and fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment, which was the usual beginning of conversations between them. She reorganized the medical supply system for the outer settlements, Owen said. All 9 of them, new tracking process. Iris says it is better than what we had before. Cale kept walking. I saw the report. She did it in 12 days. I know. Owen was quiet for a moment, then carefully he said, She is not what I expected. No, Cale said. What did you expect? Cale thought about it. It was the kind of question he would usually redirect or not answer, but Owen had asked it with the particular directness he reserved for important things, and so Cale considered it honestly. Someone easier, he said finally. Someone who would settle into the role. And instead? Cale stopped walking. He stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and looked at the far end of the passage. Someone who is building something, he said. I am not sure yet what it is. Owen waited. She made Clara talk, Cale said. In Deepwater. 12 years, and Clara never gave the council a full picture of what that settlement needed. Alara was there for an hour. He paused. She did not do anything complicated. She just listened like she meant it. Owen said nothing, but his expression shifted in a small, specific way. The name thing, Cale said. I thought it was about defiance. And now? Owen said. Cale looked at him. I think it is about something I have not fully understood yet. Owen nodded slowly, with the look of someone who thinks the other person is getting somewhere they should have gotten sooner, but is glad they are getting there at all. He did not say that. He just nodded, and they walked the rest of the corridor and went their separate ways, and Cale went back to his study, and sat at his desk, and looked at his name on the cover of the report in front of him, printed there in plain black letters. Cale Voss. Alpha King. Both of those things. At the same time. He thought about the 7th step from the bottom of the back staircase, and a boy who wanted to see the world without being seen in it. He sat there for a long time. The 5th month brought a cold that settled hard over the Thornvale territory. The outer settlements reported frost early, and Alara moved her schedule of visits forward by 3 weeks to get assessments done before the roads became difficult. She took Dean with her instead of Owen, because Owen was needed for the border patrol changes they had put in place, and Dean was good company and an efficient note-taker, and she had decided she liked him. She was gone for 11 days. Cale noticed her absence the first morning without quite intending to. It was not that the house was quiet. The house was always active. Wolves came and went with information. Owen was in and out of the east study. Nadia ran the main office with her usual precise energy. Everything was as it had always been. But there was no one at the far end of the breakfast table reading a book and drinking coffee. There was no one in the walled garden in the afternoon sitting on the low stone wall. There was no one who came into the evening meetings with a notebook already open, and 2 questions she had thought of before the meeting started. He caught himself on the 3rd morning standing in the kitchen doorway looking at the empty seat at the end of the table, and he felt something that he recognized, belatedly, as the particular discomfort of a person who has discovered they have been paying more attention to something than they realized. He went to his study and worked. He worked very efficiently for the entire 11 days. When Alara came back on the 12th morning, she brought 11 detailed assessment reports, a correction to a supply error that had been misallocated for 2 years, and a very small carved wooden bird that one of the children in the settlement of Clearfield had pressed into her hands before she left, which she carried in her jacket pocket, because she did not want it to get damaged in the bag. She came into the kitchen and found Cale already there. He looked at her when she came in. "You are back," he said. "I am," she said. She poured her coffee and sat down, and the kitchen was warm again, and the seat at the end of the table was no longer empty, and neither of them said anything about any of that. He read her 11 reports that evening. He read them start to finish, all of them, which was 240 pages of assessment data, covering 9 settlements over 11 days. He had expected them to be competent. They were more than competent. They were some of the most thorough settlement reports the pack had ever produced, not because she had been formal or technical, but because she had understood, in each place, what that specific community needed someone to ask about, and she had asked about it. He sat with the reports spread across his desk and thought, For the first time since the bonding ceremony, not about whether she would eventually comply with his instruction, but about who she actually was. He thought about this for a long time. He did not reach any conclusion that evening. He simply sat with the question, which was itself something different from what he usually did with questions, which was to answer them quickly and move to the next one. At midnight he set the reports aside and turned off his lamp and sat in the dark for a minute. He thought about the word Kale, 2 syllables, the way his mother had said it with complete ease, the way a word sounds when the person saying it has said it 1,000 times and is not thinking about saying it at all, when something is simply yours and you carry it without effort. He had not heard it said like that in a very long time. He turned the lamp back on and went back to work, because there was nothing else to do with a thought like that, except set it aside and keep going. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday, at the end of the 6th month. 3 black vehicles, rolling up the main road to Thornvale, with the particular efficiency of people who had been told exactly how much time they had, and did not intend to waste any of it. Leon Ashby was the alpha of the Eastern Reaches Pack, the second largest territory in the region after Thornvale. He was tall and deliberate in his movements, and had the kind of face that suggested he had been told at some point in his life that he was impressive looking, and had organized himself around that fact ever since. He came with 4 of his senior wolves, a beta named Caleb with quick eyes and a guarded expression, and 3 council members who stayed slightly behind Leon in all interactions, the way people do when they have learned that stepping level with their leader is not encouraged. The summit had been arranged 6 weeks earlier, to address a dispute about boundary usage rights along the shared eastern line, a matter of genuine complexity that had been building for 2 years. Kale had agreed to host it here, rather than on neutral ground, which was itself a statement about confidence. Alara stood at the entrance to the main house when the vehicles arrived, beside Kale and Owen. She wore a dark blue jacket and had her hair back, and she looked, to anyone watching, like a Luna who had been doing this for years, instead of 6 months. She shook Leon's hand when he offered it and looked at him directly, and Leon gave her a look that was measuring and slightly more interested than it should have been for an introduction, which Kale noticed from his peripheral vision and filed away. The first day of the summit was formal and structured, working through the documented history of the boundary dispute with maps and records spread across the long table in the main meeting room. Leon's people were prepared. Kale's people were equally prepared. Alara sat 2 seats to Kale's left and said very little, but when she said something it was always accurate and always moved the conversation forward. On the evening of the first day, Leon's beta Caleb approached Owen in the corridor outside the dining room. "The Luna," Caleb said. "She has not addressed him by title once today." Owen looked at Caleb with an expression of complete neutrality. "Has she not?" "Not by title, not by name," Caleb said. "In front of the delegation, in formal sessions. She addressed every point accurately and usefully," Owen said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Leon noticed. "Good evening," Owen said, and walked away. Leon raised the subject at the dinner table on the second evening, toward the end of the meal, when the conversation had relaxed into the kind of territory that serious men allow themselves to enter when they have had enough wine to feel like candor is appropriate. He did it smoothly, in the way of someone who does things like this for strategic reasons, and has practiced making it seem spontaneous. "I have noticed," Leon said, looking at the table rather than at anyone specifically, "something interesting about how your household operates. It is a small thing, but I find it interesting." The table was attentive. 7 people, 4 of Leon's delegation, and 3 from Thornvale, Kale, Owen, and Grant, who had been invited for this evening, specifically because he had the particular quality of making people underestimate him. Kale looked at Leon. He said nothing. "Your Luna," Leon said, still relaxed, still apparently just making conversation, "does not seem to use your title, or any form of address at all, now that I think about it. I have been listening for it." "Have you?" Kale said. "I have. And I find it makes me wonder." Leon looked up from the table now, and the look he gave was friendly on the surface, and not particularly friendly underneath it. About stability. The table was very quiet. Alara, who was sitting at the far end with Nadia, turned her head toward the main table. She had heard. The room was not large enough for her not to hear. She did not move for 1 second. Then she picked up her glass, and stood and walked to the main table. and found an empty chair between Grant and one of Leon's council members, and sat down. She did not make an announcement of it. She simply moved and sat, and the table reformed around her as though she had always been there. "I am sorry," she said pleasantly, in a voice that carried to everyone. "Were you asking me something?" Leon looked at her. His expression was still smooth. "I was making an observation," he said. "About the household." "About me," she said. Equally smooth. Equally pleasant. "Please go ahead." Leon set down his glass. He had the look of a man who had started something and was finding it somewhat more complicated than expected. "I was observing that in a pack the size of Thornvale, formal address is significant. That it signals, among other things, the unity of the Alpha's household." "I see," Alara said. She looked at him thoughtfully, as though considering his point with genuine interest. "And what does the address of a Luna to her Alpha signal, in your reading of pack dynamics?" "Respect," Leon said. "Alignment. Shared authority." "Interesting," she said. She let a beat pass, "Because in my experience, which admittedly is not as long as yours, respect cannot be performed. It either exists in how people actually work together, or it does not. And the words people put on top of that reality do not change the reality itself." She paused. "The Eastern Boundary Protocols that your pack has been operating on for 2 years contradict 3 clauses of the Joint Territorial Agreement that was signed before either of us were in our current positions. The discrepancy has cost both packs resources." She let another beat pass. "I found it in the records yesterday. I would have mentioned it this morning, but the session was already full. We can address it tomorrow." Leon stared at her. Grant, to her left, picked up his glass and took a very small sip. "As for the unity of this household," Alara continued, in the same conversational tone, "I can offer you this. The 6 settlements that were operating at below adequate resource levels 6 months ago are now fully provisioned. The border security interval that left a 35-minute window vulnerable in the early morning hours has been closed. The medical supply allocation across 9 outer communities was restructured and is now accurate. Those things did not happen because someone sat at a table and used the correct words. They happened because people in this household worked together effectively." She looked at Leon directly and smiled, which was the most dangerous thing she had done all evening, because the smile was entirely real. "Does that address your concern about stability?" There was a silence. Leon looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Kale. Kale was looking at Alara. His expression was very still and almost impossible to read, but in the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, there was something that had not been there before this evening. Something that was not quite what any word Kale Voss typically allowed himself to feel, but was pulling in that direction. "The boundary protocol discrepancy," Leon said finally. "You said you found it yesterday." "In the archived records, yes," she said. "I can show you the specific clauses in the morning." Leon nodded slowly. "That would be useful," he said, and his voice had changed. The smoothness still there, but the strategic edge underneath it, gone. The dinner moved on. People began talking again. Someone at the far end made a comment about the wine. Kale did not look away from Alara for almost a full minute after she turned back to her own conversation. Grant, watching from beside her, saw exactly what was on Kale's face in that minute, and very carefully refilled his own glass, and said nothing at all. On the last evening of the summit, after Leon's delegation had retired to their rooms and the main house was winding down for the night, Kale found Alara in the corridor near the library. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. They stood there for a moment. "The boundary protocol," he said. "It is real," she said. "I will give you the full file tomorrow." "That is not what I was going to say," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did not have to do that." She looked at him. "Yes, I did," she said simply. He was questioning the pack's stability. "That is not something I will let stand." "You defended this house," he said, "without using my name or my title once." She tilted her head slightly. "Names and titles were not what that situation needed," she said. "It needed facts." He looked at her for a long moment. In the corridor light, his face was very clear. No shadow, no careful distance, just his face, and what was on it was something she had not seen there before, something that was not controlled, and not arranged, and not managed. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked down the corridor to her room. And he stood there alone in the corridor, and looked at the place where she had been, and thought about a woman who had walked to a dinner table in the middle of a political meeting, and dismantled an argument with 3 minutes of precise information, and a real smile, and had done all of it, without once speaking his name. He had not needed her to. That was the part he could not stop thinking about. Leon left the following morning. He shook Cale's hand at the door with the particular grip of a man who is recalculating his position, and knows the other person can see him doing it. He looked at Alara when he shook her hand and said, with what seemed like genuine acknowledgement, "You are more prepared than I expected." "I usually am," she said pleasantly. He almost smiled. Then he walked to his vehicle. Owen stood beside Cale on the front steps, as the 3 black vehicles moved back down the main road. After a moment he said quietly, "The Eastern Boundary Clause, she found that in one afternoon." "I know," Cale said. "Our legal advisor has been reviewing those documents for 2 years." "I know," Cale said again. Owen was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She is very good." "Yes," Cale said, "she is." The words sat there between them, flat and simple and completely true, and Cale did not add anything to it. Inside, Alara was back at the long table, with the archival files open in front of her. Dean was across from her with his own notes. They were going through the boundary documentation, with the methodical patience of people who understand that correct information is more useful than fast information. Nadia appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, and set one near Alara, without being asked. Alara looked up and said, "Thank you," and then went back to her documents. Nadia stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the scene in front of her. Alara's dark head bent over the papers, the organized stack of files, the small carved wooden bird sitting on the corner of the table where Alara had put it, having carried it in her pocket for 3 weeks now. The wooden bird was very simple, the kind of thing a child carves when learning, all rough edges and good intention. Alara had placed it on her work table the same way she placed everything she cared about, without drama, as a simple fact. Nadia went back to her own work. The summit had changed something in the house. It was not large, and it was not immediate, but it was there. The way a temperature change is there before you can specifically name how many degrees it has shifted. People in the house moved differently around Alara now, with the particular respect that goes not to a title, but to demonstrated competence. They had seen what she could do with a dinner table in 3 minutes. Cale felt it too, though he would not have used the word respect, because he would have said he had already respected her, which was true in the way that looking at something from a distance is a version of seeing it. This was different. This was closer. He spent the day after the summit doing routine work and found himself thinking about the corridor and the way she had said, simply, "Yes, I did." No performance. No bid for recognition. Just, yes, this was the thing that needed doing, so I did it. He thought about what it would feel like to live like that, to move through the world from that kind of ground, knowing what you were and acting from it without announcing it. He spent a long time thinking about that. At the end of the working day, he went to the kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee and took both of them to the main reading room, which was where she usually was in the late afternoon. He set 1 cup on the table beside her, without saying anything, and sat down in the chair across from her and opened the report he had brought with him. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He did not explain. He just read his report. After a moment, she picked up the cup and went back to her own reading. They sat that way for an hour, reading in the same room, in a silence that did not ask anything of either of them. It was the most comfortable thing that had happened between them in 6 months. It was not enough, but it was something. And something, Cale Voss was slowly and inconveniently beginning to understand, was what the year had always been about. The message arrived at 20 minutes past midnight. Owen knocked on Cale's door hard enough that the sound carried down the corridor, and before Cale had finished pulling on his jacket, Owen was already speaking. 2 outer settlements, Clearfield and the small farming community south of the ridge called Mossbank, had reported coordinated intrusions on their borders. 3 patrol wolves were unaccounted for. The communications relay at Mossbank had gone silent. Cale was moving before Owen finished. In the corridor, Alara was already there. She had heard. She stood in the hallway in practical clothes, her hair loose, a notebook in her hand, and she looked at Cale and said, "What do you need from me?" No title, no name. just the direct question. Mossbank has a medical room, he said. You know the settlement. I know it, she said. I visited in the 5th month. Then come. They moved. The drive to Clearfield took 50 minutes on roads that were dark and uneven in the early morning cold. Owen drove fast. Cale sat in the front, on the phone with the patrol leader, getting information in pieces. Alara sat in the back and used the time to review what she knew about both settlements, population numbers, building layouts, where the supplies were kept, who the community leaders were, and what their strengths and limitations were likely to be under pressure. When they arrived at Clearfield, the situation was controlled but close. 2 patrol wolves had been found, shaken but physically unharmed. A third had not yet been located. The perimeter had been compromised at 2 points in the southeast quadrant, which was the pattern of a coordinated approach, someone who had observed the patrol timing and planned around it. Cale went to the perimeter with 4 of his senior wolves. Alara went to the community hall. Clara met her at the door. Clara, who had been running Clearfield for 12 years and was not easily alarmed, had the look of someone who had been holding a frightened community together for the past 2 hours by sheer force of steadiness. She looked at Alara, and something in her face shifted, some small release, the way a person breathes differently when they know they are no longer the only competent person in the room. 12 families, 43 people, Clara said. 3 children under 5, no injuries. The 2 patrol wolves who were found are here. One has a cut on his arm that needs proper treatment. Alara was already moving into the hall. She found the first patrol wolf, a young man named Ben, who was maybe 20 years old, and trying very hard not to look as frightened as he was. And she sat down beside him and talked to him in a direct, calm voice about what had happened. And while he talked, she cleaned the cut on his arm with supplies from the settlement's medical kit, and her hands were steady, and she did not hurry, either the conversation or the work. It took 6 hours to find the 3rd patrol wolf. He was located at the Mossbank border at dawn, cold and disoriented but uninjured. By then, Cale had been awake for 32 straight hours, and the perimeter had been re-established and reinforced, and a temporary additional patrol rotation had been put in place. He came into the community hall at 6:30 in the morning and found Alara at one of the long tables, which had been turned into a coordination station overnight, with maps and a supply ledger, and a list of the 43 community members organized by location and need. She had 2 cups of coffee in front of her, both nearly empty. A child of about 4 years old was asleep under the table with her head on a folded jacket, because her parents were helping with the perimeter work and had asked Alara to keep an eye on her, which Alara had done without interruption to any of the rest of what she was doing. Cale looked at the table. He looked at the sleeping child. He looked at Alara. She looked up at him and said, "Ben is all right. The cut was clean. The 3rd wolf is back?" "He is back," Cale said. "Good." She pushed one of the coffee cups toward him. "There is about half a cup left. It is not warm." He sat down and drank it. It was cold, and not particularly good, and he drank every drop. They stayed in Clearfield for 2 more days, because Mossbank still needed support, and the temporary patrol rotation needed to be tested, and there were community members who needed to see that the Alpha King and Luna of Thornvale were present, and not leaving at the first sign of stability. Cale and Alara worked in the same spaces for 48 hours without any real separation, not because they were choosing to stay close, but because the work required it. They found a rhythm. It was not a rhythm they had discussed or arranged. It emerged the way efficient cooperation emerges when 2 people are skilled and facing the same problem, and both want to solve it. She took the community management, the people, the resources, the organization of bodies and supplies. He took the perimeter, the wolves, the external coordination with the Thornvale patrol teams. They moved between each other's work regularly, checking and updating, and it was fluent in a way that would have surprised them both if they had been stepping back to observe it, rather than living inside it. On the 2nd night, the community hall was finally quiet. The children were asleep in the back room, with 2 older community members watching over them. Most of the adults had gone to their houses. Clara was asleep on a bench with her jacket over her. Ben and the other patrol wolves were in the patrol room with Owen. Cale sat at the coordination table, with a map of the perimeter in front of him. Alara sat at the far end of the same table, leaning back in her chair, her eyes closed. She was not asleep. She was doing that thing she did sometimes where she went very still and very internal. processing, somewhere inside her head. The hall was warm from the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up. The lamps were low. Cale looked at her for a moment. "Ilara," he said. She opened her eyes. He had not planned what he was going to say. He had not planned to say anything at all. The word had come out on its own, her name, just her name, the same way his mother's voice came to him sometimes. Not a memory exactly, but an imprint, the pattern of sound that means a specific person to you. She was looking at him from the far end of the table. "I need to ask you something," he said. His voice was different. He could hear it, lower and less controlled than his usual voice, the voice of someone who is tired enough that the careful arrangement has slipped a little. She waited. "Say my name," he said, "just once." He heard how it sounded as he said it, not a command, nothing close to a command, the absolute opposite of the thing he had said in the stone circle 7 months ago. It was a request, with nothing underneath it, except exactly what it was. "I just want to hear it once. From you." The hall was very still. Ilara looked at him across the length of the table. She looked at him for a long time, and in the lamplight her face was open in a way that it was not usually open. Or maybe it was always open and he was only now able to see it. The softness under the steadiness. The real person behind the capable one. She shook her head slowly. It was not cruel. It was not cold. She shook her head the way you say no to something you care about because you have to, not because you want to. "Not yet," she said quietly. "I am sorry." "Not yet." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence they had ever shared, heavier than the one in the stone circle, heavier than any of the ones in the meetings or the corridor or the garden. Because this one had nothing combative in it. This one was just two people who were exhausted and had been through something together, and one of them was asking for a small, specific thing, and the other was saying she could not give it, and they were both sitting with that at the end of a very long night. Cale looked at the map on the table. He nodded once. He did not say anything else about it. After a while, Ilara stood up and went to check on the children in the back room. Cale stayed at the table and went back to the map. Outside, the wind moved against the walls of the hall, and the lamps burned on, and the night passed the way nights do when you are staying with them, rather than sleeping through them, slowly and in full. They drove back to Thornvale on the morning of the third day, Owen at the wheel, both of them in the back this time, sitting with their separate thoughts in a quiet that was too tired to be anything complicated, and so was simply quiet. When they got back to the main house, Ilara went directly to her room and slept for 9 hours. Cale went to his office and worked for 4 hours, and then sat at his desk and looked at nothing for a while. Something had shifted in those 2 nights. He could not have named it exactly, not in a word or a phrase that would have satisfied him the way precise things usually satisfied him, but it was there. It had the quality of something becoming true that had been working toward truth for a long time, without being ready. He was beginning to understand that asking her to say his name was not the same as asking her to give him something. It was asking her to say it and mean it, and those were entirely different things. He thought about that for a long time, before he finally let himself sleep. In the days that followed, the pack noticed the change, even if they could not have named what exactly had changed. Cale moved through the house differently. Not visibly. Not in any way that would have made anyone point and say, "Look, something is different." But the wolves who knew him well, Owen, Grant, Nadia, old Ruth who had watched him since he was 8, they felt it, in the way you feel a shift in weather before any instrument can measure it. He started doing small things he had not done before. He stopped in the kitchen one morning and talked to the 2 young wolves who handled breakfast preparation, not about work, just briefly, asking one of them how his shoulder was recovering from an injury he had sustained 3 weeks earlier in a training exercise. The young wolf looked as though he might say something to mark the occasion, and then thought better of it, and simply answered the question, and Cale listened and said he was glad it was improving, and continued on his way. He went to the walled garden one afternoon, not because he had a reason to be there, but because he was walking past, and it was a calm afternoon, and he went in and sat on the low stone wall for a while. He sat in the same place Ilara had sat during those first weeks, the wall that faced south and caught the afternoon light, and he looked at the view she had been looking at during those early conversations. He stayed for about 20 minutes and then went back to his work. Owen saw him coming out of the garden and said nothing. He had been Owen long enough to know that some moments required nothing, except the courtesy of not commenting. Alara, for her part, felt the change too, in the specific way she felt everything in this house, through the evidence of small things. The coffee that appeared beside her in the reading room without explanation, now a regular occurrence. The way Cale started remaining in the main hall after evening meals instead of withdrawing to his office immediately, sometimes for as long as an hour. The fact that he had started thanking people by name in meetings, not just Owen and Felix and Grant, but the younger wolves, the ones who had not expected to be addressed directly by their alpha. She watched these things carefully and without comment. She was 9 months into a year that had begun as a declaration and was becoming something she did not have an exact word for. A week after they returned from Clearfield, she sat in the kitchen early in the morning and wrote in her notebook. She wrote a list, not of tasks, but of things she had observed about Cale Voss in 9 months of living in the same house with him. The list was factual and not romantic and not sentimental. It was the kind of list you write when you are trying to understand something honestly. He memorizes names, every wolf in the pack, down to the newest children in the outermost settlements. He knows them. He reads every report himself. He does not delegate his understanding of the situation to anyone else. He does not sleep enough. He is more careful with people when he thinks no one is watching him be careful. He has not once been unkind to me, even when he was angry. He asked me to say his name at the end of a 2-day crisis, in a tired voice, without any command in it at all. She read the list back. Then she closed her notebook. She went to her room and found the small carved wooden bird from Clearfield sitting on her windowsill. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was rough and simple, and someone had made it out of care rather than skill. And it was one of the things she had carried from that settlement, because it felt true. She set it back on the sill and went to start her day. The year still had 3 months left. She had said she would not say his name, and she would not. But she was beginning to understand, in the particular way you understand something, when the evidence builds slowly enough that you cannot point to the exact moment it became clear, that the year was never going to end the way it had begun. It was going to end differently. She did not know how, but differently. The archive room was at the back of the east wing, behind a door that Alara had walked past many times in 9 months without going in. It was not a prohibited space. It was simply the kind of place that a person comes to when they are ready to come to it, and she had not been ready until a wet Thursday morning, in the 9th month, when she was looking for records related to a land boundary, and someone told her the oldest documentation was in the archive. She went in expecting survey maps. She found them. She also found everything else. The archive room was long and narrow, with shelves running floor to ceiling on both walls. The shelves held bound volumes organized by year, going back almost 2 centuries. The air was cool and dry, and had the particular smell of old paper and preservation chemicals. Alara set her notes on the work table near the door, and found the survey maps she needed within 10 minutes. She should have left then. She had other work waiting. But she was a person who read thoroughly, and the shelf to the left of the survey maps held the record books from the years of the previous Alpha's rule, and she found herself looking at the spine of a volume labeled with the year Cale would have been 9 years old, and she pulled it from the shelf. She was not looking for anything specific. She was curious, the same way she was curious about everything, with an open, unpressured interest that did not require a particular result. She found what she found on page 62. It was a formal pact decree, written in the precise administrative language that official pact documents used, and countersigned by 3 senior wolves of that era. The decree was dated in the winter of the year Cale was 9, 3 months after his mother Helena died. It read, in the careful formal phrasing of official documentation, that henceforth and until his formal appointment as Alpha, the heir of the Voss line was to be addressed only by his formal pact designation. That designation was listed as heir, and later, as the documents progressed, young Alpha, and eventually, at the ceremony of appointment, Alpha King. The decree stated explicitly that the use of the heir's given name by pack members was to be discontinued, as it was deemed inconsistent with the dignity of the position and the clarity of the succession. Alara read it twice. She sat down in the chair at the work table and read it a 3rd time. The language was formal and dry and carried no emotion in it, which was itself a kind of emotion, the specific absence that you feel when something human has been removed from official language on purpose. But what the words said, stripped of the formal phrasing, was this. A 9-year-old boy, who had just lost his mother, was told by his father, in writing, countersigned by witnesses, that people would stop using his name. He was not Cale anymore. He was the heir. Then, he was the young Alpha. Then, he was the Alpha King. She sat in the archive room for a long time. She thought about the bonding ceremony. She thought about the command in the stone circle. She had heard it as arrogance, as the particular arrogance of a man who was accustomed to giving instructions and having them followed, and who had not learned to ask for things differently. She had responded to it as arrogance, with the absolute certainty that she was right. She had been right. About what it was, about where it had come from. Those were different things. She pulled more volumes. She read carefully, the way she read everything, fully and in order. Over the next 2 hours, she assembled a picture that was neither flattering nor damning, but simply true, the way true things usually are, more complicated than the story you had been telling yourself. Marcus Voss had been a powerful alpha. By the records, a genuinely effective one. The pack had grown substantially under his leadership, and the territory had been well managed. He had also been a man who believed, with apparent conviction, that personal relationships were a weakness in leadership, and that any attachment to ordinary human things, to names, to warmth, to the visible enjoyment of others, made an alpha less rather than more. Alara found a letter in a volume from the year Cale was 12. It was a letter from the pack's old physician, a wolf named Bernard, addressed to Marcus Voss and concerning the young heir. It was written with the careful restraint of a man who wanted to say something important without losing his position, and it said, gently but clearly, that the boy was doing well in his formal training, but that Bernard was concerned about his isolation, that the heir had no close companions among his peers, and seemed to have no expectation of warmth from any quarter. Beneath it, in a different hand, was a single line that was apparently Marcus's response. The response said, "Isolation is preparation." Alara set the letter down. She looked at the shelf of volumes around her, all those years of careful documentation, and she thought about a boy on the 7th step from the bottom of the back staircase, watching the world from a position where no one could see him. She had asked him about that once, in the 5th month, over a morning that had been easier than most of their mornings. She had asked where he had actually lived inside this house as a child, and he had told her about the step. He had said it the way people say things they have not said out loud before, with the particular surprised quality of a fact that has been stored somewhere private for a long time, and has forgotten what it sounds like when spoken. She had said, without planning to say it, that is a child who wanted to see the world without being seen in it. He had said nothing. She understood now what she had only intuited then. She returned the volumes to their places with care, and left the archive room, and walked down the east wing corridor, and through the main hall, and out into the walled garden, because she needed to be outside. The day was gray and cool, and the garden was mostly bare at this time of year. The stone wall, and the bare-branched shrubs, and the pale sky above them. She sat on the wall, and looked at the view she had looked at dozens of times, and thought. She thought about what she would do with what she knew. The easy version was to simply carry on as she had been. The year had 4 months left. She had said she would not say his name. She would not say it. What she had learned today did not change that agreement she had made with herself. But she was also honest enough to recognize that the agreement she had made with herself 9 months ago was based on a reading of a situation that had been incomplete. She had been right to make it. She was not wrong to have held it. But the person she was now, sitting on this wall in the 9th month, knew more than the person who had stood in the stone circle, and felt a command land on her, and made a decision. She sat in the garden for a while, and let herself be sad about it, which was the honest response, and therefore the one she chose. Sad for the boy on the 7th step, sad for the 9-year-old who lost his mother and then, in the same year, lost the ordinary human thing of being called by the name she had given him, sad for the 23-year-old, who had taken on an entire pack with nothing inside him that had been allowed to be personal. She allowed herself to feel it fully, because the alternative was to manage it the way he managed things, from the outside, carefully, and she had never done that, and was not going to start. After a while she wiped her eyes, which had been wet without her precisely noticing, and sat up straighter. She still had 4 months. She intended to use them. She was not going to say his name. Not yet. But she was going to do something else. Something she had been considering for a while, and now understood more fully. She was going to find a way to show him that she saw him. Not the Alpha King. Not the title, or the role, or the controlled, precise exterior. The actual person. She walked back into the house with a specific thing in mind. She found Owen, in the corridor near the East study, and stopped him. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly." Owen looked at her with his steady, watchful eyes. "All right," he said. "His mother," she said. "Helena. Do you know what she used to make for him? A meal she made that was his, specifically." Owen was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Then he said, "A soup. She made a potato soup with rosemary and smoked salt. He asked for it every winter." He paused. "He has not had it since she died." "Thank you," Ilara said. She went to the kitchen. She spent the afternoon there, which was itself unusual enough that Nadia appeared in the doorway at one point, and looked at the pots on the stove and the herbs laid out on the counter, and said nothing at all, which was the wisest response available. Elder Felix came in near the end of the afternoon for his usual cup of tea, and stopped when he smelled it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the stove, and his old face did something complicated, that he smoothed away quickly. "That is a smell I have not smelled in this house in a long time," he said quietly. Ilara looked at him. "I had the recipe from Owen," she said. "Is it close?" Felix came to the stove, and stood beside her, and looked into the pot. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Add a little more rosemary," and he said it in the voice of a man who is trying to be practical, because being anything else would be too much. She added more rosemary. He tasted it, and nodded once, and went to make his tea, and sat in the corner of the kitchen with it, the way he often sat, quietly, with the particular patience of very old people, who understand that the important things take time to arrive, and there is no point rushing them. That evening, Ilara left a bowl of the soup outside Cale's study door. There was no note. She had considered a note, and decided against it, because a note would have been about the gesture, and she was not interested in the gesture. She was interested in the thing itself. She knocked once, and walked away down the corridor before he opened the door. She heard him open it, the soft sound of it, and then silence. She did not look back. In his study, Cale stood at the open door, and looked at the bowl on the small table beside the doorframe. He looked at it for a long moment. He could smell the rosemary and the smoked salt and the particular combination of things that he had not smelled in over 15 years, and that landed somewhere inside him, that was not at all in his chest, but much deeper than that. He picked up the bowl. He went back into his study. He sat at his desk and ate the soup slowly, in the quiet of the room, by himself. He did not go back to work for a long time after he finished it. The next morning Cale came to breakfast earlier than usual. He sat in his chair at the head of the table. The kitchen was warm, and the household was moving around him in its usual morning rhythm. Ilara came in a few minutes later, and poured her coffee, and sat at the far end of the table, and neither of them said anything about the previous evening. But when she sat down, Cale said, without looking up from the papers he had brought with him, "It was exactly right." She knew what he was referring to. She said, "I had help." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, still not looking up, "I did not know you had been in the archive." She paused. "I was looking for survey maps." Another silence. "And did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. His voice was very even. Too even. The specific evenness of someone managing themselves carefully. She considered her answer honestly. "Not exactly," she said. "I found something I was not looking for." He set down his papers and looked at her. She held his gaze. She was not going to apologize for knowing something true about him. She was not going to look away. But she was also not going to weaponize it, or make it a thing between them. She was simply going to let him know she knew it, and let him decide what to do with that. "I am not going to use it against you," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long time. His face was not controlled in the usual way. It was doing something more uncertain than that. Then he looked back down at his papers and picked up his pen. She drank her coffee. The kitchen moved around them. Through the window the morning was gray and cold. The day was starting. Felix came in for his tea and looked at the two of them at opposite ends of the table, papers and coffee and the ordinary business of the morning, and the old wolf said nothing, and made his tea, and went back to wherever he always went with it. It was an ordinary morning, and it was not at all ordinary, and both of those things were true at the same time, and both of them sat with that, and that was how the 9th month continued forward. No. The first note appeared on a Tuesday. Cale found it on his desk when he came in from the early morning patrol briefing, a small card set precisely at the corner of his map, where he would see it immediately, without it being in the way of anything. The handwriting was Alara's, which he recognized now the way he recognized most things about her, through simple familiarity, the particular way she moved and spoke and organized things. The card said, "I see the man who knows every wolf in this pack by name. Every one." Nothing else. No signature. She did not need to sign it. He stood and read it twice, and then set it down carefully, and went to the window. He stood there for a moment, and then he went back to his desk and placed the card in the top left drawer, under the edge of the duty roster, where it would not be seen by anyone who came in and needed something from his desk. He told no one about it, not Owen, not Felix. He went to the morning council meeting and conducted it efficiently and completely, and did not think about the card again until evening, when he opened the top left drawer to check the roster, and saw the corner of it. He took it out and read it once more and put it back. The second note came 3 days later, left in the small break between the bookshelves in the library where he sometimes stood to read rather than sitting, a habit she had apparently noticed. This one said, "I see the man who stays up past midnight reading settlement reports he could assign to someone else. He stays up because he wants to understand for himself, not because he was told to." He stood in the library and read it standing up, the way he had been standing when he found it. He did not know what to do with this. It was not a weapon, and it was not a gift in any ordinary sense. It was just a fact, seen clearly and stated plainly, and the fact that she had seen it, and was telling him she had seen it, was doing something to him that he could not fully manage into something orderly. He put this one in the same drawer. The third note was on his pillow, which meant she had come into his room to leave it, and the thought of that, the simple domestic fact of her walking into his room to leave something that would reach him, was more significant to him than he let himself look at directly. This one said, "I see the man who asked me not as an alpha but as a person, at the end of a long night in Clearfield. That is the man worth speaking to." He sat on the edge of his bed and held this one for a long time. He had asked her that night to say his name. He had been tired enough that all the management had slipped. He had asked from somewhere that was not authority and not strategy. He had asked from the place that was simply him, the part of him that had been quiet and hungry and unaddressed for years. And she had said no. And she had written this. He put it with the others. By the end of the 10th month, there were 7 notes. They were all different. None of them were long. All of them were specific, precise observations about him as a person, rather than as an alpha king, the kinds of things you only know about someone if you have been paying very close attention for a long time. One was about the way he always looked east, out of any window he stood at, the direction of the territory where most of his current concerns were located, as if he could see it from wherever he was. One was about the fact that he thanked people by name now in a way he had not done when she first arrived, and that every wolf who received one of those small, specific thanks carried it differently afterward, as though they had been made more themselves by it. That one he read 3 times. He kept them all in the top left drawer, which had become, without his making any decision about it, a place that was entirely private. The meals changed in the 10th month, not formally. It was not arranged or discussed. But Cale began staying at the table after the evening meal, and Alara began staying too, and they began talking in the ordinary way of people who have established, without anything being announced, that there is now a time in the day when they will be in the same place having a conversation. They talked about the pack, about the settlements and the boundary work and the upcoming winter preparations, but they also talked about other things, the way people do when they have run out of a reason not to talk about other things. He told her once about a difficult situation he had handled badly in his 2nd year as Alpha, a border dispute he had approached with too much force and too little listening, and how it had cost the pack an alliance that had taken 2 years to rebuild. He told her this directly, without softening it. She listened, and then said, "What did you learn from it?" Not, "That must have been hard." Not, I am sure you did your best. Just the question, which was the only thing that mattered. He thought about it seriously, that I was more interested in being right than in resolving the problem, he said. She nodded. And now? Now I try to ask which one I am being before I decide what to do. She picked up her cup. That is a harder thing to learn than most people manage, she said, and went back to her drink, and the evening continued. Owen walked past the dining room at 9:30 one evening, and looked through the doorway, and saw them at the far end of the table, Cale talking and Alara listening in that particular complete way she had, and he stopped walking for a moment. He had been beside Cale for 11 years. He had watched this man manage his life with the particular careful control of someone who had concluded early that the things you kept at a distance could not hurt you. He had watched him lead excellently and personally at great cost to himself, and had said nothing about the cost, because Cale had never asked, and Owen had understood that asking was not welcome. He watched them for a moment longer, and then walked on. Nadia found Alara in the archive room the following week, which was not unusual now. Alara had been going back to the archive, not to look at difficult documents but to organize them, because the system had been neglected and useful information was buried under poor organization, and she could not walk past a problem like that without doing something about it. You look different, Nadia said, leaning in the doorway. Alara looked up from a volume she was cataloging. Different how? Nadia considered. Settled, she said. When you first came here you were calm, but it was a particular kind of calm, the kind you carry when you are waiting to see whether something is safe. This is different. This is the other kind. Alara turned a page. You are observant, she said. I have had to be, Nadia said. What kind of pack would this be, if no one was paying attention? Alara smiled at the page she was reading. There was 3 weeks left in the year, and she was not counting them as relief. She was not waiting for the year to end. She was, she realized, going to miss certain parts of it, the particular structure that the constraint had given to everything, the way the absence of his name had made everything else between them more visible, more specific. They had been forced to communicate without the shorthand that names provide, and in that forced specificity, she had learned more about who he was than she might have learned in 3 ordinary years. She had also been learning something about herself. She was, as it turned out, the kind of person who could hold something like this. She had wondered on the first night of the year whether that was true. She knew now that it was. One evening, 2 weeks before the year ended, Cale sat across from her after dinner with a book open in his lap that he was not reading, and he said, without looking up from the page, I want to tell you something. All right, she said. I owe you an apology, he said, for the stone circle. She looked at him. Not for wanting you to use my name, he said, for the way I asked for it. He looked up from the book. It was not a way of asking at all. It was a way of establishing something. And you were right that it was not appropriate to what that night should have been. The room was quiet. I accept that, she said. And I want you to know something in return. He waited. I understand why you wanted it now, she said. In a way I did not on that night. He looked at her steadily. A year is a long time to think, she said simply. He nodded. Just once. They sat in the quiet for a while longer, with the evening around them, and the sound of the house settling in the dark, and 2 weeks left of a year that had started as a line drawn in the stone circle, and had become something entirely different, something neither of them had known how to name at the beginning, and were still not in a rush to name now. A week before the end of the year, something new happened. Cale found her in the reading room, and sat down across from her, and set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. He did not say anything. He just put it there, and looked at her. She put down her book and opened it. It was a hand-drawn map of the Thornvale territory, extremely detailed, every settlement marked, every patrol route, every boundary line. It had taken considerable time to produce, she could see that. The level of care in it was not the work of an hour, or even a day. On the top of the map, in his handwriting, it said, Everything I am responsible for, and why. She looked at the map for a long time. There was something in it that she recognized, because she had been writing notes to him for 6 weeks, and so she understood what it felt like to try to put a true thing on a page for another person to find. The map was his version of the notes. It was what he could offer. Not the things she had offered, not the quiet, specific observations, but something practical and large and honest in its own way. The full weight of what he carried, and an acknowledgement that she was now someone he wanted to carry it with. She looked up from the map and found him watching her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She folded the map carefully and held it, and he went back to whatever he had been going to do before he sat down. And neither of them made anything more of the moment than the moment was, which was the way they had learned to be with each other across a long year of being forced into honesty. On the last Sunday before the year ended, Ilara went to find Elder Felix. She found him in his usual chair in the East Hall, with his tea and the particular settled quality he always had, as though he had been sitting in that chair for so long that the world had simply arranged itself around him. She sat down across from him. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked at her over his cup. "Then ask," he said. "When you conducted the ceremony," she said, "the bonding ceremony, the night that all of this started, did you know then that he would do what he did?" Felix was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. He had been talking about the formal structure of the house for several weeks before the ceremony, how things would be organized, what the expectations would be. He paused. He was managing everything he could manage, because a bonding ceremony is something you cannot fully manage. She thought about that. He was afraid, she said, not as an accusation, as a fact. "Of course he was," Felix said simply. "He has been Alpha King for 11 years, and has not allowed himself to be afraid of anything in all that time. Walking into a bonding ceremony is an occasion for fear, if you are a person who knows what closeness costs." She sat with that for a moment. "Do you think he knows that about himself?" "He knows it now," Felix said. "Whether he knew it then is a different question." She nodded slowly. Outside the East Hall windows, the late afternoon light was going. "Can I ask you something?" Felix said. "Of course," she said. "Are you ready," he said, "for the year to end?" She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. "Yes," she said, "and I am also not sure what it ends into." Felix looked at her with the clear, old eyes that had been watching this pack for decades. "That is the most honest answer to that question," he said, "and I think you know that not being sure is not the same as being unprepared." She looked at him. "You have been preparing for 10 months, he said. "Both of you have. The year was never going to end at the beginning. It was always going to end here." She left him with his tea and walked through the house in the late afternoon quiet. Through the corridors, she knew now, the way you know a place you have lived in, and worked in, and been present in for a long time. Through the east wing and the main hall, and past the reading room and past the kitchen, up the back staircase. She stopped on the 7th step from the bottom. She stood there for a moment in the dim stairwell light. She thought about a boy sitting here, watching and not being watched. Seeing everything, named by no one. She stood on his step for just a moment longer, and then she went up and into the ordinary evening of the house, carrying everything she knew, which was considerably more than she had known on the night she had stood in the stone circle. 1 week left. Cale woke on the morning of the 365th day, and lay in the dark for a while before he got up. He had not planned for this to feel significant. He had told himself at various points over the year that it was simply a date, a number, and that a number meant nothing without what you put around it. He believed that. He also woke in the dark of that morning, and lay still, and understood that he had been counting toward this day for a long time. He got up and dressed in plain clothes, and went down to the kitchen before any of the household was awake, which put him there at 10 minutes past 5. He made coffee, and sat at the end of the table that was not the head, the chair he had started using sometimes when he came down early, and looked at the kitchen in the dark quiet. He thought about the bonding ceremony. He thought about the stone circle and the torchlight and the pack gathered around them, and the specific mistake he had made on that night. He had known for some months now that it was a mistake, not what he had wanted, but how he had reached for it. The command, the crowd, the public certainty. He had reached for the one thing that had always worked for him when he was afraid of something, which was to control it as quickly as possible. And he had used it on a person who could not be controlled, and had no interest in being controlled, and was going to demonstrate that fact to him for an entire year. He had learned a great deal in 12 months. He had learned that the thing he had actually wanted on the night of the bonding ceremony was not a title on someone's lips, It was to matter to a specific person as a person. He had wanted Alara Stone to say his name the way his mother had said it, without ceremony and without strategy, because he was simply the person she was speaking to, and his name was what she called him. He had asked for that in completely the wrong way. He drank his coffee and thought about all of it, and then he set his cup down and went out into the cold morning to walk the grounds, because sitting still with everything in his head was not something he could continue doing. The Thornvale grounds in early morning were gray and wide, the grass pale with cold and the sky beginning its slow lightening in the east. He walked the outer path that circled the main house and the training grounds and the gardens, a walk that took about 40 minutes at a normal pace. He had done it thousands of times. He did it now and felt every step of it and did not hurry. When he came back around to the walled garden, he stopped. Alara was there. She was sitting on the low stone wall, the one she had sat on in the early months when they had their most difficult conversations. She was wearing a heavy coat and holding a cup in both hands, and she was looking out at the view she had always looked at from that wall, the south view, the open ground that stretched toward the tree line. She was not looking at him. She had put herself in this place on purpose. He stood at the gate for a moment and understood what this was. She had come to the place where it had started. She was here because today was the day, and she was giving him the choice, the option to come in or not, to make the first move or not, to be the one who crossed the distance if that was what was going to happen. She was always doing that, he understood now, giving him the choice. She had been doing it from the beginning. She had drawn her line clearly and firmly and had never moved it, but she had never once tried to take away his. She had left that entirely to him. He opened the gate and walked into the garden. She heard him. She turned her head and looked at him as he came across the grass toward the wall. Her face was quiet and open, not performing anything. He stopped a few feet from her and stood, the way he had stood in this garden many times before, but without the jacket of deliberate distance he had always worn then. Just him, standing in his coat in the cold morning, with the gray sky above them and the territory stretching out behind her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I am going to say this morning." "Take your time," she said. He almost smiled at that. Almost. "I have been thinking about it for weeks," he said. "I want to do it right." She waited. She was very good at waiting. He had come to understand that her waiting was not passive. She was always fully there inside it, attending to everything while she waited. "I was wrong on the night of the ceremony," he said. "Not about what I wanted. I was wrong about how I reached for it." He looked at her. "I wanted to hear my name from you. I wanted it very specifically, for reasons I did not understand at the time, and understand much better now. What I did instead was turn it into a command, in public, so that I would not have to actually ask for it." He paused. "Because asking for something means it can be refused. Giving a command means you do not have to face that." She was listening completely. "I have been afraid of being refused for a very long time," he said. "It is easier to command. You cannot be turned away if you never actually make yourself available to be turned away." He looked at the ground for a moment and then looked back at her. "But what you get, when you manage everything like that, is exactly what I had. A life where everything runs correctly and nothing actually reaches you. Where you are a function, a title, where you run something competently and alone." The garden was very still around them. "The notes you left me," he said. "The soup, the map I gave you, these last months." He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of speech easy. She knew that and was not rushing him. "I did not know it was possible to be known by someone without giving them a weapon," he said. "I thought knowing and power were the same thing, that if someone knew something real about you, they had something to use against you. Every person in my life, with very few exceptions, confirmed that." He looked at her directly. "You did not do that," he said. "You found things out about me, and you left me notes. You made me soup. You stood up at a dinner table and defended this house without using my name once. You said no to me in a cold community hall at 2 in the morning, in a voice that was not unkind." He paused. "You held a year that started as the hardest thing anyone has done in my house, and turned it into something I have no good word for, something true." He took a breath. "I am not commanding anything this morning," he said. "I am not asking either, because I already asked once, and you said no, and you were right to say no, because it was not the right time." He looked at her. "I am just telling you that I am here, that I am the person who is here, not the Alpha King, not the title, just the person. And that whatever you decide to do with this morning is yours to decide." He stopped. The garden was silent around them. The light was coming up slowly in the sky, the east turning from dark gray to pale. A bird somewhere beyond the wall made a sound and then was quiet again. Ilara looked at him. She had been looking at him the whole time he spoke, not around him, not at the middle distance, directly at him, with the complete attention she gave everything that mattered to her. She set her cup down on the wall beside her. She looked at the space between them. She looked at him. And everything the year had been gathered into this one morning. All the meetings and the notes and the soup and the drives and the nights in Clearfield and the conversations that had happened and the ones that had not. All of it was here, in the garden, on this specific morning. And both of them were here with it. And both of them knew that whatever happened next was not the end of something but the beginning of it, and that that was the only way it could have been. Because anything built on a command would have been built on sand, and this was built on stone. He was standing 3 feet away from her, and he was not the Alpha King, and she was not the thing she had been required to become in the stone circle a year ago. And both of them were simply 2 people in a cold garden in the early morning, and the year was done. She looked at him. He waited. The morning light was coming in from the east, and it was finding the garden slowly, touching the stone wall, and the pale ground, and the edge of the bare-branched shrubs, and then finding them. Ilara thought about the stone circle. She thought about the drive to Clearfield in the dark, and the community hall, and the cold floor, and the bowl of soup outside his door, and the notes she had written by lamplight, and the 7th step from the bottom of the back staircase, and the archive room, and the decree, and a 9-year-old boy who had lost the sound of his own name in the same year he lost his mother. She thought about everything she had learned about him over 12 months of paying careful attention, which was a great deal, more than she had expected to learn, and more than she had expected to want to know. She thought about the thing Felix had said to her a week ago, that not being sure was not the same as being unprepared. She had been preparing for 10 months. She thought about his voice in the community hall at 2 in the morning, stripped of everything, just a person asking a person for a very small, very human thing. She thought about the map he had drawn her and left on the table between them, all those routes and settlements and boundaries, everything he was responsible for, drawn by hand, in considerable detail with the single line at the top, "Everything I am responsible for, and why." She thought about the morning she had come back from the 11-day assessment trip and found him already in the kitchen, and the way he had looked at her when she walked in. The particular look that a person has when they were not expecting to have missed something as much as they did. She thought about all of it, quickly, the way you think about things that you have actually already decided, reviewing the reasoning, not to find the answer but to confirm it. She stepped down from the wall. She walked the few steps across the cold grass toward him, and she stopped close enough that she was in the space that was not the formal space between them, the meeting room space or the dinner table space, but the actual ordinary space of 2 people who are talking about something that matters. She looked at him. He had not moved. He was standing in the early morning light, with his hands at his sides, and his face entirely open, in a way that she was certain he did not know it was, the way a person's face is when all the management of it has been set down, because there is simply nothing left to manage against. She saw him, not the Alpha King, not the function and not the title, and not the controlled, careful, precisely managed person she had met in the stone circle, the person who had sat on the 7th step and watched the world, the person who had read 240 pages of settlement reports himself because he needed to understand things directly, the person who had asked her, at 2 in the morning in a community hall in Clearfield, in the most honest voice she had heard from him, to just say his name once. She saw him clearly and without reservation, and she said it. Cale. Just his name. 2 syllables, said quietly, the way you say something you have been holding carefully, and are finally setting down in the right place. The world did not stop, no great noise, no dramatic moment. The garden was still the same cold garden, and the light was still the same pale morning light, and the bird beyond the wall made its sound again, and was quiet again. But his eyes closed. Just for a second. Just for the length of a breath, the particular way a person closes their eyes when something they have been bracing against for a very long time simply stops. when the thing they did not know they were still carrying is finally set down. When he opened them, she was still there, which she thought was perhaps the thing he had been least certain of. She was there. She held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she did not move back, and the morning was still cold, and the ground was still pale, and everything around them was entirely ordinary. And inside that ordinary morning, something had changed that was going to stay changed. He did not say anything. Neither did she. After a moment he exhaled, a long, slow breath, the kind that a person draws before they have had a chance to stop themselves from drawing it honestly. He looked at her, and in his face was something she had never seen there, not in 12 months of looking at him, something that had not had room to exist inside the controlled, managed, titled life he had been living. He looked like himself. That was the only way to describe it. He looked like a man who was, for the first time in a very long time, looking at someone who knew his name and had chosen to say it, and that man looked entirely like himself. "Alara," he said, her name in his voice. Simple as that. She understood why that was enough. She had always understood. That was why the year had been worth it. They stood in the garden as the morning light continued to come in from the east, unhurried, and neither of them reached for anything else right away. They had spent a year in a house together, and now they were going to spend years more, and there was no reason to rush the particular moment they were in. Around them, the territory was waking up. Somewhere in the main house a door opened. The smell of coffee beginning to brew came from somewhere. A wolf called to another wolf on the patrol line in the distance, something routine and practical. The pack was getting on with the morning. And in the walled garden, in the pale light of the 365th day, two people stood close together, in the ordinary way of people who have found their way to each other by a long and specific road. And the silence between them was not empty, and not a contest, and not the charged waiting silence of two people who have not yet decided what they are to each other. It was the other kind. Owen knew before anyone told him. He came into the kitchen at 6:30 and looked at the two empty coffee cups on the counter beside the machine, and looked at the back door that led out to the walled garden, and looked at the morning through the kitchen window, and he said nothing to the two young wolves who were starting breakfast, and who were not yet paying attention to the specific details that older wolves in a pack learned to read. He made himself coffee and went to the east study and sat at his desk and worked, which was what he did when things happened that were important and that he intended to let happen without interference. Nadia found out at breakfast, which was not through any announcement, but through the simple fact that Alara and Kale came in from the garden together, which they had never done before, and sat at the same end of the table, which they had also never done before, and talked in a low, ordinary voice about something related to the eastern boundary that Nadia suspected had been discussed in the garden, but that they were now reviewing in the practical daylight way of two people who have settled something important and are ready to get on with the work. Nadia poured her coffee and sat in her usual chair and said good morning to both of them, and asked Dean, who had arrived early and was looking at everyone with the alert attention of a man who has noticed something is different and cannot identify what, to pass the bread. Dean passed the bread and looked at Kale, and looked at Alara, and looked at Nadia, who gave him a look that said clearly, "Not yet. Let it be." Grant came in last, as he usually did. He was old enough that his pace in the mornings was his own pace, and no one asked him to change it. He came to the table and found his usual chair, and accepted the coffee that one of the young wolves brought, and looked at the table with his old clear eyes. He looked at Kale at one end, and Alara beside him, and then he looked at his coffee, and the particular expression on his face was one that Nadia, who was watching, found difficult to describe except that it was the expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time, and is experiencing the particular quiet satisfaction of being confirmed. Felix arrived at 9 o'clock for his usual morning consultation with Kale on pack matters. He found Kale in the east study with Alara, both of them at the central table with maps and a supply report and 2 cups of coffee, the comfortable shared workspace of people who have been in this room together many times and know how to occupy it. Felix looked at the scene in front of him. He sat down and put his papers on the table and said, "Before we begin, I need a moment." Kale looked at him. "Go ahead." Felix took a long breath. Then he said, "I was the one who was asked to preside over your ceremony 11 months ago. I stood in the stone circle and said the words, and then watched what happened. And I will tell you plainly that I went home that night, and thought about it for several hours. He paused. I was not certain I had done the right thing. Cale was very still. Not in presiding, Felix said. In not saying something before the ceremony. In not speaking to you about what I had been watching you carry for a long time. He looked at Cale directly. I watched you grow up. I watched what Marcus Voss decided to do with you when you were 9 years old, and I did not say enough about it then, and I did not say enough about it since. He looked at Alara briefly, and then back at Cale. You are a good alpha. You have been a better alpha than I would have predicted when you were a boy on the stairs. But the parts of you that are good have had to fight through a great deal to survive. The East study was very quiet. Cale said nothing. He looked at Felix with a face that was not closed and not managed, the same face that Alara had seen in the garden that morning. I want you to know, Felix said, that I am glad of where this morning finds you, and I am sorry. It was as long and as difficult a road as it was. Cale put his hand on the table. It was a small gesture, not dramatic, but it was the gesture of a man who is receiving something and is not going to deflect it. Thank you, Felix, he said. Felix nodded. He cleared his throat and picked up his papers. Now then, he said, in his usual council voice, the Eastern Boundary Review. They worked through the morning. The boundary review took 90 minutes. Afterward, there were 3 separate settlement matters that required decisions, and Alara contributed to each one with the precision and usefulness that had become simply the expected quality of her contributions. Cale listened, questioned, decided. The work was the work, and it was done well. In the afternoon, Cale walked out to the training grounds where several of the younger wolves were working through their form exercises. He stopped at the edge and watched for a while, and then he called out 3 names, corrections to what he was seeing, specific and useful corrections, without any particular weight of rank in them. The young wolves adjusted, asked questions, received answers. One of them, a 17-year-old named Finn who had been working at Thornvale for 8 months, looked at the Alpha King as he walked back toward the house and said to the wolf beside him, in a low voice, "He seems different today." The wolf beside him, who was 19 and had been at Thornvale a year longer, said, "Good different." Finn thought about it. "Yes," he said, "good different." Alara spent part of the afternoon with Iris, the pack healer, reviewing the medical supply allocation for the coming winter. Iris had been watching the developments in the household with the particular attention of a healer, which is the attention of someone who understands that physical health and the health of the surrounding relationships are connected in ways that cannot be separated. Iris looked at Alara across the supply table and said, "You look rested." Alara almost laughed. "I feel it," she said. "The medical supplies for Deepwater are fully adequate now for the first time in 3 years," Iris said, going back to the ledger. "The system you put in place in month 5 is holding." "Good," Alara said. "Also," Iris said, not looking up, "I noticed this morning at breakfast that the Alpha King did not sit at the head of the table." "He did not," Alara agreed. "He sat at the east end," Iris said. "Where you were sitting." "That is right." Iris made a note in the ledger. "I see," she said, and moved on to the next supply entry, and Alara went back to her own notes, and neither of them said anything more about it. The evening meal was full that night. All the senior pack members, the whole household, the warmth of people who know each other well and have shared many evenings in the same room. There was food, and there was conversation, and there was the low, steady sound of a community at ease with itself. Cale sat at the head of the table, because he was the Alpha King, and that was where the Alpha King sat. Alara sat to his left. This was not new. But the way they spoke to each other at that table was different from how they had spoken across it for the previous 11 months, and the wolves who had been paying attention, which was most of them, felt the difference without needing to discuss it. After the meal, as people began to gather their things and move toward the door, Ruth made her way around the table to where Alara was standing. Ruth was 70 years old and moved slowly and with great deliberateness, and when she reached Alara, she took both of her hands the way she had done on her birthday evening, holding them firmly. "I told you," Ruth said. 10 months ago I told you." Alara held the old woman's hands. "You did," she said. "Something worth the trouble," Ruth said. She nodded once, with the satisfied finality of someone who has been proven right and is not modest about it. And then she let go, and moved slowly toward the door. Owen found Cale at the end of the evening in the south corridor, which was where they often ended up when things had happened that were worth a conversation. They walked the length of it together, as they had done many times. "Well?" Owen said. "Well?" Cale said. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it is worth, I think you handled this year better than I expected you to." Cale looked at him. "You expected me to handle it badly?" "I expected you to be much more stubborn for much longer," Owen said, which is essentially the same thing. Cale considered this. "She is very difficult to be stubborn against," he said. "Yes," Owen said. "I noticed." They reached the end of the corridor. Owen stopped at the junction that led to his office. He looked at Cale and said, in the way of a man saying something he has been saving for the right moment, "She is good for you. Not because she is soft with you, but because she is not. And you needed something that was not soft with you." Cale said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Owen nodded. "Good night," he said. "Good night," Cale said. He walked back through the house and up to the second floor. He stopped at the door of his study. Through the window at the end of the hallway, the night was clear and the stars were out. The same stars that had been out on the night of the bonding ceremony a year ago. The same sky over the same territory. He thought about standing in the stone circle with the torchlight, and the crowd, and the command he had given. The specific reaching for control that had been his only available response to something that frightened him. He thought about a year of mornings and evenings and meals and meetings and drives and crises and conversations and notes left in drawers and soup outside doors and maps left on tables and a community hall at 2 in the morning and a cold garden at 6 in the morning. He thought about 2 syllables spoken quietly in the early morning light. He went into his study and sat at his desk. He opened the top left drawer. The notes were there, all 7 of them, folded neatly in a small stack under the edge of the duty roster. He took them out and looked at them. He could hear the house settling in the dark. He could hear the far-off sound of the night patrol, a wolf, calling across the distance, routine and clear. Everything he was responsible for was out there in the dark, doing what it was supposed to do. He put the notes back in the drawer. Then he picked up a piece of paper and a pen, and he sat at his desk and wrote. He wrote for about 20 minutes, not long, just until he had said what he needed to say. When he was finished, he read it back once, and then he folded it, and he stood up. He walked down the hallway to the second door on the right, and knocked once, softly. She opened it. She had been reading, still dressed, the lamp on. She looked at him in the doorway and did not say anything. He held out the folded paper. "I wanted to write it down," he said, "because I said a great deal this morning, and I meant all of it, and I wanted you to have it in a form you could keep." She took it. He looked at her for a moment in the doorway. Then he said, "Good night, Alara." "Good night, Cale," she said. His name in her voice, easy and natural now, the way a word sounds when it belongs to the person saying it, and they are not thinking about saying it at all. He walked back down the hallway to his room, and she closed her door gently, and the house settled into its night sounds, and the patrol called across the territory in the dark, and the stars above Thornvale were exactly as they always were, and the ground below them was, quietly and completely, changed. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened the paper. It was not long, it was not elaborate, it was simply what it was, which was enough. It said, "A year ago, I told you what to call me. Tonight, I want to tell you something true. You are the person who made me worth being known by name. I did not know I needed that. I know it now. Thank you for the year. Thank you for what you did with it. And thank you for saying it." She folded it carefully and set it on the bedside table. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and the territory and the far-off patrol, and thought about how the most significant things are almost always simple. A name, a year, a person who held both of them carefully until they were ready to mean something. Outside, Thornvale was exactly what it always was, a large and well-managed territory, with a pack that was healthy and growing, and looked after by 2 people who were learning, in the oldest and most honest way, what it meant to lead something together. Inside, in the dark, Alara Stone held a folded piece of paper against her chest, and was, in the complete and grounded way she did everything, content. And the year was over. and something was beginning.